We are back, Empires of the Future. Today, going to be talking about something that I would say a lot of people haven't necessarily heard of, and that is the first sexual revolution. But we'll get to that in a minute. First, Denton, how you been doing?
Oh, been doing well. It's mushroom season right now, so I'm trying every chance I get to get out in the woods and try and find some morel mushrooms. And,
I thought you were just talking about getting mushrooms on your pizza. It's the season for that.
You know what? It's always the season for that.
I agree.
I enjoy mushrooms on my pizza, but now specifically going out and hunting for wild mushrooms, I've only gotten to go out once so far this year, so it's kind of depressing. Been a bad year for just been busy, but haven't been able to get out there much, but hoping to later today, maybe.
Well, good.
If this rain
you all
doesn't
may
get too
hear the thunderstorm behind us as we're talking about this very serious topic today. You never know. So yes, we've been doing that. It is disc golf season, I guess, for you. It's always disc golf season.
Yeah, it's always disc golf season.
Not for me. I think some of y'all are crazy throwing discs in the freezing cold, but you do.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, things are going well. How about for you? What's new with you?
No, that's about it. Trying to get out and play some of the disc golf, and it's warm out, so we've been running again. We're back.
Oh yeah. We started back up last week.
Yeah,
getting back into the running season, which has been really good. Mm-hmm. Gosh darn, man, doesn't it get harder and harder with kids and schedules to find time to get together and run? It's tough.
Yep.
I was very thankful that kind of things have worked out, that we can get together at least a couple times a week.
Yep.
Get our runs in together. So, definitely am enjoying that. Are you signed up for the half marathon this year?
I said I was going to do that. I got to do that.
You got to do that.
I got to do that really soon.
Maybe on every podcast between now and then, I'll just bring it up until you're.
There you go. I assume you have, since you're asking.
I have.
Yeah, I will.
I was on it.
I got to get in for the end of the month, because I think that's when price increases.
Yep.
So, all right. Well, let's jump into it, because we got a lot to talk about here. The sort of typical story you might hear about how sexuality has been expressed in the past is sort of this simple, the church and morality, traditional morality, just held down what people wanted to do sexually. It's this sort of weird liberation story of everything was held down, and then thankfully through the 60s we began to attain freedom, and man, we're just getting freer every year, and it's just going great. Okay, look, that's just not historically what has gone on, and so we want to be clear about this, and this is a story from First Things called The First Sexual Revolution by a fellow named Kyle Harper, titled January 1st, 2018. So it's about a 7-year-old article, but we're going to talk through what really is, in history, the first sexual revolution, what sexual norms were in this Roman society of the time, and how Christianity changed it, and why in our day, there are plenty of people who, when they take an honest look at the consequences of the sexual revolution, are not always going, wow, just endless progress and things are just getting better all the time. And so obviously we would not take that view, but people like, for instance, Louise Perry she's written a book called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. And she is particularly saying that for women in general, the consequences of the sexual revolution are clear, and they are not good. And so it is most useful to me to know the truth, and that's our only goal today, is to talk through this era in history around what Kyle Harper calls the first sexual revolution, about what kinds of things took place. So we're going to go back to this time. This man, Kyle Harper, has written a book called The Fate of Rome, Climate, Disease, and the End of an Empire. So this is a shorter article summarizing a lot of his work around that book. And it starts by introducing us to a figure called Epictetus. He says Epictetus was the sort of figure that only the Roman Empire could have produced. He sought to attain the Stoic ideal of apathy. A majestic indifference, he says, to all things without moral value, including pain and death. And so true freedom, taught Epictetus, is not a legal condition, and he was an ex-slave, but a kind of moral zen achieved by emancipation from the passions, including the pangs of sexual desire. So here is probably the first curveball for everybody. Our first person who is trying to control himself and advise all other people around him to control themselves, not just sexually, but certainly sexually, but in all ways, is this fellow Epictetus. And so you have a situation, well, why was he doing that? Well, that's because he saw that in his world, you can't control much of what happens around you. And anything you hear, you still hear, Stoicism is sort of in the background in our day, but you'll hear people say, well, you should only worry about things that you can control. That is a Stoic impulse still alive in our day. We are largely Epicureans, trying to maximize pleasure. And what is behind a lot of what we have seen in our sexual revolution is this idea of not just maximizing pleasure, but building your life around pleasures, and some of the peaks being sexual pleasure. But he thought, okay, if I'm going to achieve what he thought was an ideal, and that is apathy, meaning indifference to all things without moral value. So this is the other thing that you have to take in here that is very surprising, that he is leaning into and has as a goal something that is of moral value. And he says that pain and death don't necessarily have moral value. You can't control them, so be indifferent to them. Now, that is a Stoic ideal that I think we are not anywhere near seeking, much less attaining to today. But once again, I want to we have not arrived at Christianity yet. And he says this: true freedom is not a legal condition, but a kind of moral zen achieved by emancipation from the passions, including the pangs of sexual desire. So keeping desires at arm's length is a Stoic ideal that is here pre-Christian and driven by Epictetus. Had you ever heard of anything like this before you read this article?
No, I don't think so. I mean, if I did, it was in a class and I forgot. But certainly, as an adult in conversation in relation, especially to kind of the Roman Empire and their approach to sex and sexuality, it was never from the direction of a Stoic who is seeking to sort of bring these things into under control, right? Almost all of it has been from the perspective of, well, the Romans just did whatever they wanted sexually, right? There were no rules per se. When in reality, actually, what this article is helpful in doing is saying, well, actually, there kind of were, but were rules that are just very different than what Christianity then went on to introduce.
Right.
Which is why he's calling it the first sexual revolution.
Right.
That Christianity brings. But it is interesting to hear of this guy. Now, how'd you pronounce his name? Epictetus?
I say Epictetus.
Epictetus. Epictetus. It is interesting to see that, and actually, I think he points this out later in the article, so not to jump ahead, but he does say things and present ideas that do sound almost akin to some of the things that Christianity teaches, specifically that the Apostle Paul teaches. Like there almost sounds like and seems to be some crossover, namely in the idea that there would be any sort of restraint put upon sexual desire, sexual gratification, right? Because he is saying, no, it's good to restrain these things, but he's doing so from a different perspective than what Paul is doing so, right?
Yeah, and it looks like the Apostle Paul had a background in Stoicism, so that you do see some of this at least pointed to in the Bible in his writings, but this is a unique ideal here to it's not exactly our term apathy that they are after. Most of the time when anybody we know of who talks about apathy, they're not talking about seeking moral value and trying to be uncaring towards negative things.
Right.
It's just this is a particular kind of apathy. And one way to clarify some of this and sort of the developments that these philosophies have taken in the past couple of thousand years is that something like a Buddhist ideal would be, you are seeking to deny your desires day by day to lessen your desires, which does work to a degree, by the way. If you want to increase your desires, indulge them in a general. If you want to lessen your desires, deny them. This is lost in our world in a lot of ways. But then, there are, like a Buddhist monk, for instance, would likely have an ideal of denying desires to the point that you want nothing, which sounds crazy to our Western minds. But there are plenty who are successful at this, who literally want nothing, and they have to be careful to eat and drink, and they deny themselves, and they're so good at denying themselves that they can attain to that. Now, in stern opposition, the typical Western response is to go, I want a lot, so I will take a lot, see my desires increase, and keep on trying for my outside world to match my inner desires, which actually we are much less successful at. Because if you don't temper your desires, you will encourage them, and they will basically grow out of any bounds because you're encouraging that. You are giving in to them, and then they grow. And so that task of trying to get the outside world to come around to your desires doesn't meet. It's actually less attainable, it seems, to the Buddhist goal.
Right. What you're saying is the more, which is the Western idea, is gratification of desires, and the more you gratify desires, the greater they grow. Which I think is true. Like, no one has ever been like, I gratified my desires. Now my desires are completely satisfied, and therefore I am satisfied. What is the term for the psychological term by that one dude? I know that's not very specific, but self-actualization.
Oh yeah,
right. I am self-actualized. That doesn't make sense. I have attained this by gratifying my desires. My desires are hereby gratified.
Yeah.
I can die in peace. No, that doesn't exist.
Yeah,
that does not exist.
We leave Abraham Maslow aside for a minute and go, if you've ever wanted a cinnamon roll and then you ate the cinnamon roll, you have noticed that either A, you want another one immediately, or B, you certainly want another one the next day.
Yeah,
and probably
that's right.
two.
That's right. It's the idea of no one eats just one chip.
That's right.
Like, I just want to taste it.
And incidentally, where are we in the Western world? We have signaled all of our wants so much that the chip makers are going, oh yeah, we would love to try to make you want lots more chips.
Yeah.
So our entire culture is built around this, and so it's useful as a fish to recognize what kind of water you're swimming in, and it's also useful to know that there have been different kinds of water at different times in the past, and that you can choose to swim in a different way if you want to. That's just a powerful and important thing to know. But for points of clarity, not everybody was like Epictetus. I mean, this guy is a teacher. Right. He's a philosopher. He's a little more highfalutin than many. And so, in particular, the lower class lived mostly differently, giving in to desires, not seeking quite so much temperance. Now, I will say then that in Roman society, I've read enough that I can tell you that even men viewed sex as a sort of weakness, so that they did not, even though most men had a lot of control over their wives or the slaves that they had in that time, it was sort of viewed shamefully that men had to give in to sexual desire. So it's among people in general, that is a general attitude that was present in Roman society that, again, is very foreign to us. But it did come down. I mean, this is one of the things that I think we can imagine, is that views that are held by upper class, educated, tend to be, well, one, they then don't yield to the lower class. Often the lower class try to attain to the higher class views, or at least think of them as higher. That's just kind of the way that works. And so that was there, and that's quite different. One of the quotes from this that I think is make this a little clearer is says, "The tame austerity of the philosophers and the ebullient eroticism of the streets coexisted in easy proximity." So that, yes, while Epictetus was seeking his high ideals in his house, a lot of other things would have been going on next door and around the corner, because all of these things coexisted then just as they do now in our societies. It says, in fact, they shared a hidden premise. Both presumed that sex was just sex, one instinctual need among others, to be channeled in certain fundamental ways. And to not assume necessarily, I mean, you can't necessarily isolate ourselves completely from this world. So let's just point to the fact that anybody who has picked up on Christianity says that sex is important, that sex is about more than just bodies. It is about spirits, and that it has a powerful spiritual effect. And so we do get that from Christianity. That impulse comes from Christianity, whereas in ancient Rome, the attitude would have been, oh, well, at the end of the day, it's just bodies. You do what you do.
Yeah, and he's making the point that the idea of both the Stoics, like Epictetus, the ideas of that he proposes, as well as the ideas of others in his time who basically were gratifying these things. He mentions, and I think it's good to mention, like what we've discovered archaeologically from like ancient Roman cities. Pompeii he uses as an example. I've been to Pompeii, and I can tell you there was more than one brothel in Pompeii that was just like city center. It was a part of.
Yeah.
It was akin to going into a fast food restaurant, even in the fact that they had basically menus on the wall where you just like chose from the menu of what you wanted, and that would be satisfied the same way a taste for a hamburger would be satisfied, right? What he's saying is that the ideas of both the Stoics and these people who were indulging just, I almost want to say, quote unquote, willy-nilly in sexual gratification, they're both rooted in a similar idea, really the same idea of sex being, quote unquote, just sex. That it had no real significance beyond just this thing that you either gratify the desire of or you suppress the desire of, but it was functionless beyond that.
Yep.
It had no greater meaning, no greater depth. Either you were someone who happily said, this plays no important role in life, and therefore I'm going to just do away with my desires for it. Or you were someone who said, well, it's just sex. I'm just going to gratify this and then get on with my life because that's all it is. It's just a way to gratify
my day.
Yeah. Exactly. It's no different than going and eating an ice cream cone just to get on with my day. I've satisfied my sweet tooth, right? Both are rooted in an idea of sex having very little value or having a deeper meaning than just sex, quote unquote, which flies in the face of the Christian idea of sex that Paul teaches, which he's going to get into it, but which says that no sex is there's no such thing as just sex, and we would agree with that as Christians today, reading the Apostle Paul, but also just understanding the reality of what sex is, that it's not just sex.
Yeah, so let's color in a little more of the Roman view, sort of the ancient Roman view. We're painting this. A lot of what we've been painting is sort of the male side, the free male side,
because that was very different than the female side of things back then.
Right, as he says here, there were no-go zones where the rules were hard and fast. Expectations of chastity for respectable women, whether maidens or wives, were clear and inflexible. So, first of all, young women were expected to remain sexual pure, remain virgins. Wives were expected to be faithful to their husbands. Female purity, as he says, was heavily guarded. He says men were governed by entirely different rules. And so that's what we've been speaking to. He says, quote, for instance, there is not even a word for male virgin in Latin or Greek. It is a little misleading to say that Roman sexual culture had a double standard. There were very frankly two entirely different sets of standards of erotic behavior, precisely because sexual morality was determined by the imperatives of reproducing the family and the city, and the bodies of men and women had different roles in that endeavor. The perpetuation of socially honorable households generation after generation was the enduring mental frame of public sexual morality. Stoic morality, hard-edged as it might at times be, ran along the grain of this world, end quote. And so young men were expected to be sexually adventurous, or at least to have sexual experiences, but young women were specifically not. There are two entirely different worlds of what is the expectation of what are the norms, what are the rules for men and women in this time. And these are some of the things that you're going to want to watch for what changes, because this is the Roman world. Men have options, women do not. The option for a woman is to get married, and that is sexually where her world will be. For a man, particularly a free man, he had a lot of options to do what he wanted to do.
Yeah, not only did he have a lot of options, but he makes clear that like it was in a sense an expectation or a duty upon Roman men to be having sex, to be sexually active, in order to perpetuate the Roman civilization, right? It was a very it was a very different world, I guess, than what the Apostle Paul writes and proposes and perpetuates as he's so instructed by the Holy Spirit. Actually, you begin to see when you recognize this how it is that when Christianity comes along and the sexual ethics of the Christians, why it is that they were so earth-shaking, so radical, is because a lot of these things were flipped on their head by the Christian idea of sexual morality and sexual ethic.
Yeah.
Because here you have the situation where both men and women are governed by very different standards. He makes a point, not a double standard, it's two different standards entirely. And neither one of them really comes to a view of sex that sees it as how God intended it. Both fall woefully
I think
short.
the reason he seems to really push that button that it's not a double standard is generally there is a standard for women and there is no standard for men, really.
Exactly.
That is very different from sort of a +1 standard versus a +3 or +5 standard. It is like a 1 versus a 0. There is none here. There is a great standard there. And this issue probably is one that is really hard for us to get at. In a time when life expectancy, which is what we're seeing here, life expectancy in, say, 500 BC is around the mid-20s. You expect that most people would live around their mid-20s. So he says, quote, "The grim realities of Roman life expectancy also made reproduction urgent. Epictetus's short list of human duties encompassed citizenship, marriage, child production, piety to God, care of one's parents." So sex was a civic duty, which is what you were pointing to. And they were aware of something that I think we have forgotten about, is that is one of these vertical dimensions that if you don't have kids, then things don't get taken care of. Not, I mean, to mention there's nobody to take care of you, but that they were organizing families, and Roman families were much more organized than we typically think of. The idea of a patriarch and a matriarch comes to us from Roman societies where you're not talking about a nuclear family. This is larger than that. A kinship structure built around the oldest male, the oldest woman, and how everything that happens in the family is interested. The whole family has an interest in. And so that is all going on at this time. And so reproduction is important. It's considered a job for men and women. If there are no kids, then society doesn't continue. And one just side note, that we now who live in societies that are no longer having children in general, this is a problem.
Yeah, exactly.
Your society is not going to do well if there are not very many children. And we've been on a roller coaster with this in the West in our day, and in the East as well. China's had their own experiment that is now leading them to a very dire situation. But for instance, the cause of all the concern about this population increase in the 60s was the baby boom. That if kids keep popping up at this rate, and eventually those kids start having more kids at this rate too, there's going to be so many people that our world can't sustain it. And then advances in food production, for instance, lead to that's completely false. We have plenty of food, but now we are going the opposite direction in most every country in the West, and certainly some, South Korea is in a much worse place than others, but most Western countries are below the rate of filling. They're below the rate of reproducing themselves. Most women will bear less than 2 children in their lives, and then you just have fewer people, and that's economically a very bad situation. So their awareness of this, and look, it was the ancient world. A lot of people died in gruesome ways as well as everyday ways, and so they were aware of that.
Yeah, and so it's a part of that led them to say, hey, it's your duty to be producing children, period. With for the men, with very little parameters around how you do so.
Sure.
Just go produce children, right?
Yeah, and it's sort
to a
of,
certain degree.
I guess we can point to 2 worlds, because the brothel you were mentioning earlier, if you've never read about the fact that lots and lots of children were exposed in ancient Rome, which means they were just put on the side of the road for someone. If you want this child and you want to take it to be a slave, take this child. If you don't, it'll lay there until it dies. And this is just the brutality of ancient Rome. And some children were just killed on the spot, depending. And this happened in brothels, but there's also, we have letters from Roman soldiers written back to their wives, say, I know you should be having the baby soon. If it is born and it is a male, keep it. If it's a little girl, expose it. We can't have this many children. And when we different, more brutal world, but this is the world that Christianity was born into, and the brutality that Christ experienced on the cross is just a sample of Roman brutality and the brutality that existed in this ancient world, and the brutality that, frankly, is behind our world still. Evil lives in the heart of every man and every woman and every child, and if we don't have something to restrain it, it comes to the surface again. So that you should think about that when you see evils and crimes done. Every one of us is capable of these sorts of things, if not for something to hold back those impulses.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
All right, so we're going to shift gears. Shift us gears with this next, the Christian world begins.
Yeah, he says, I think this is, the way he says this is, I don't know, it's a good way to say it. He says, this was the scene, that is the scene of Roman life and what sexual ethic they had, as we've already described and laid out. He says, this was the scene onto which the Christians came loudly striding. The Christian movement's sexual demands were not just austere or unusual, he says, they were jolting, and deliberately so. The apostolic generation did not pour out of the Levant onto the open roads of the empire with anything like a detailed packet of sexual rules. And then he goes on to say, Paul's letters show us that the Christian sexual morality was settled on the go, adapting the gospel's searing ethic of radical love and interior purity to the realities of life in the towns of the empire. That line, he says, the Christian movement's sexual demands were not just austere or unusual; they were jolting, and deliberately so. And they were jolting in many ways. But in large part because of what he said there in that last line that I read, which was that it was adapting the gospel's searing ethic of radical love and interior purity to the realities of life in the towns of the empire. The idea of internal purity was something that was so foreign and shocking, and a part of what made the Christian sexual ethic so profoundly different, because it came down to more than just utility. It came down to more than just what you happen to be doing with your body. It came down to your heart, your intention, all these kinds of things. But also in many other ways, I mean, I don't know if you want to get into something of a breakdown of just how different it was, but one of the most profound ways in which the Christian sexual ethic, rooted in the gospel, as he makes clear, was a breakaway from the ethic of the day, was that it pointed to both men and women, and said, this is an individual made in the image of God and has therefore intrinsic value, divine value placed upon them by their Creator, and that is not to be done away with. It is not to be ignored. It is to be taken very seriously, and that has an effect on how they are to be viewed sexually. Which was profound, as we've already said at the time. A woman, especially a prostitute, a woman in a brothel, was viewed very, very much just like someone to be used at your whim,
As was a slave.
Yeah, exactly. That's another example. Slave. You can do whatever you want with them. They are essentially property.
Yeah, erase any concept of human rights, bodily autonomy. It wasn't there.
Exactly. Which was profound for understanding everything in life, but perhaps most notably, and because it was so anti-cultural, in the realm of sex and sexuality, because of how dramatically different it was, and jolting to the society and to the culture. But this is what Christianity. This is where we see the revolution happening. And I want to take a pause and sort of move us back forward to today. Today, there is a concept that you will hear atheists agree with. That is that all human beings have intrinsic value.
Yeah.
Right? This is something that many people agree with today, whether Christian or not. But it is not an idea that was always there. It was an idea that is rooted in a Christian worldview, a Judeo-Christian worldview. This idea that individuals have value and dignity. This is not something that you could have said to a Roman at the time and they would have just definitely agreed with you. Yeah. It was sort of introduced by Christianity into this culture. And so that's just one way we can look at today and see sort of a resulting thought or frame of reference, which we would say is good, even if the world today doesn't recognize where that intrinsic value comes from. We can still say it's good that they recognize that, but that is a result from this, what he's calling the first sexual revolution that was brought about through Christianity and to the Roman Empire.
Yeah. If you have curiosity about this and sort of how Paul chooses to speak of it, I would recommend to you 1 Corinthians, a book which I remember reading as a very young Christian and was very surprised to find topics discussed in there, in particular topics related to sexuality. And so Paul just clearly lays it all out in terms of some things that have been going on that need to not be going on, the pagan influence and the general influence that you all have taken in is not going to be able to survive if you're going to walk with Christ. And many of the passages that we might mention at our weddings come out of these greater discussions that Paul is having. I think about how at a certain point in Ephesians, Paul says, the wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also belongs to her husband. The husband's body, similarly, does not belong to him alone, but also to his wife. And he says this is only going on in marriages. Right. And in a marriage, those two are becoming one, so that I believe we're in 1 Corinthians when he says to not deny each other except by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourself to prayer, that he lays out what even in our churches, I don't know if we have a particularly clear idea of, because we are swimming in a different set of ideas today. And Paul says, what you are doing in a marriage is you are promising openness to each other sexually and closedness to everyone else. And that's a very serious thing that is enduring and it will not be changed. I mean, I think of 1 Corinthians. Do you not realize that a man who gives himself to a prostitute, who has sex with a prostitute, is one with her in spirit, that he joins himself to her? And how then could that man be joined to Christ's spirit if he is also trying to be joined to a prostitute? These kinds of things don't work, right. He says. But then he also says that is what some of you were. Some of you were male prostitutes. Some of you were giving yourselves into sexual sin, but you have to leave that life behind if you're going to have a new life with Christ. And so all of this is present there, and it is all summarized in a word that we see here emphasized. He says, quote, the keystone of Paul's reaction to the Corinthians was his steadfast opposition to fornication, or porneia in Greek. The word's underlying associations are rich and esoteric, and we must approach the term with due caution, he says. Consider that the Latin word for it, fornicatio, seems to have been invented for no other purpose than to capture all the fugitive associations of the original. Fornication in English is a churchy word with little place in the vernacular. He says, as I tell my students, it is impossible to imagine fornication in a text message or tweet. The root of the word in Greek is prostitute, porne. In ordinary Greek from the classical period onward, the meaning of porneia was prostitution. Before Jews and Christians took hold of the term, the exclusive meaning of porneia was prostitution in the active sense, from the pimp's or prostitute's perspective. Porneia was the business of trading sex for money, not the act of patronizing a brothel, and certainly not premarital or extramarital sex tout court. And so Paul says, look, sex outside of the covenant of marriage is illicit, is wrong. And so that is his expansion of the word porneia and his indictment on all of Roman culture, saying, God intends for you to be a certain kind of people. There is one God, and you need to be his one people, and that will affect your lives. We should not count it as some surprise in our day that the Christian sexual ethic is under assault. It is tied to everything else in the Christian life, as sex has been tied throughout history to various religious emphases. It is we are not surprised that in ancient pagan religions, large sexual orgies would take place in attempts to please pagan gods. But that meanwhile, what we have expected of Christians here is committed monogamy or abstinence.
Right. That's exactly right. And it once again is another picture of the Christian sexual ethic being so different, in that the word porneia now is not simply used for a female prostitute, but Paul is saying all of those who engage in sexual relation, or sexual gratification or whatever outside of marriage, whether male or female, they are engaging in porneia and fornication, in sin.
Right.
So he is taking this term, applying it not just to specifically female prostitutes, which is how it would have mostly been associated at the time, but is now applying it differently to all the believers who would engage in sexual gratification outside of monogamous marriage, which is, again, is radical, right? For the time, for the day. And I think, at least touching on it as he does, it's worth noting how this word is also associated with our relationship to the Lord. How when believers, and specifically it's applied oftentimes in the Old Testament, how God's people at times will prostitute themselves out to other gods, where they play the whore. And whore themselves out to other gods. And I think just as applicable in the New Testament, we who engage in sinful desires and give into idolatry, we, in a very real and spiritual sense, commit a form of spiritual porneia, fornication. We whore ourselves out to other gods. And when you think of it in that nature, it does become a lot more graphic. You begin to see sin more rightly as the affront that it is. It hits a little bit differently, I think. And it should. It should. We should view it in that way. In the same way, if your spouse, whom you have an expectation of fidelity to you, if they go and engage in relations with someone else, you are rightly bothered and offended by that. It is a grave sin, and you understand that. It's different than... it helps you understand differently than when we think of how we do the same to our Lord. We whore ourselves out in that way. It's very serious.
And the idea is you're giving yourself to something. If you are after sexually something other than a committed marriage and a covenant, which, by the way, if you have been to a Christian marriage, you will see that covenant is between those two people and God. And so God is involved in that marriage as the goal, that both of those people are giving their lives to God. And within that, he says, yes, I am aware that you are sexual beings. In fact, I made you that way.
Right.
And this is how I designed all of this to be fulfilled. And so that is what he's after. And I don't know that you used exactly this word, but in terms of, there are some parts of this that try to get words right. And he says that for instance, we use euphemisms that people might be living together or they slept together.
Cohabitation.
To soften some of these terms. But he says the English term harlotry may still capture some of the abrasive sound of this evocation of covenant infidelity. Paul and many other Old Testament prophets biblical writers are not afraid to use bold language to say, you need to realize this is an affront to God. Mm-hmm. And we don't do anybody any good by using softer words, especially exclusively to describe things that are detestable to God. Sins that Jesus died for, activities that will, if we're not careful, damn our souls. Right. So we don't help anyone by just adapting to language. I watched a TED Talk the other day about dictionaries, and just keep in mind that the way dictionaries often operate is they just see how people are using words, and then they say, okay, that's what that means. Well, we all are getting to choose the words that we use on a daily basis, and you should choose your words carefully. You should know things that are harmful, we can speak about them that they are harmful, and things that are helpful and good, we can speak about them as if they are helpful and good, and we don't help each other by softening certain words.
That's right. That's right. And so we shouldn't.
I agree.
Yeah. He goes on in the article to talk about the body being the temple, site of sacred communion, and sexual sin, therefore, is a kind of pollution. It's as scandalous and disruptive as the desecration of a holy sanctum. This is an idea that we see in the scriptures put forward by the Apostle Paul, as he is so inspired by the Holy Spirit, that our bodies are a temple of the Lord, and therefore that changes the way we, again, view everything, but particularly how we use our bodies sexually, just as you already mentioned and brought up, that to join oneself to a prostitute, as Paul says, is to engage in a spiritual act. It goes beyond just mere gratification of the flesh, just a biological thing, an activity to be engaged in. It's something much deeper, much greater. And so here we see that the Christian worldview is giving to sex, is applying to sex, actually deeper meaning, which was different from the Roman world, which basically viewed sex in very low terms, had a very low view as far as the value of sex and human sexuality. The Christian ethic is actually one that says, no, sex is something that is of great significance, which, it shook up the Roman world. But for us, certainly for myself as a husband, I say yes and amen. The sexual act is one that does have a deep significance. And in the same way, it is so detrimental and harmful to a relationship to engage in sex outside of those bounds. So in this case, adultery is so harmful to a marriage. It's devastating to marriage. But likewise, engaging in the biblical and prescribed use of sex in the context of a marriage between a husband and wife is very fruitful and beneficial to each other and to the marriage. It strengthens the marriage. It builds that bond. It is, as I think Matt Chandler, he might not have been the original one to coin this term, but he certainly popularized it. It is a mingling of souls, in a sense. And so we say that the Christian ethic actually provides value and holds sex in high regard, which is very different from the Greco-Roman view of when it came into being, came into existence.
Yeah, I mean, it would be probably simple enough to say that to the Romans, sex between humans was of little to no difference between versus sex between animals, and Paul highlights that is not true, and that sex matters. It says here, quote, Paul concedes in his letter to the Corinthians that marriage is a legitimate safeguard. Because of the laws of the city, the followers of Christ would be allowed to marry. But Paul's words are hesitant and qualified. Ideally, he writes, followers of Christ would be, as he is, in a state of sexual abstinence, possibly, but not certainly, lifelong celibacy. Marriage is permissible, but only by way of concession, not command. So as aside here, so marriage is an option. It is not, we are not as Christians ever saying that someone has to be married. In fact, one of the things that Paul says is just what we see here. He says, I wish that all were as I am, because I can be fruitful for the gospel. But He says each man has his gift from God, one has this gift, another has that, and then he moves on. It says here, quote, "Yet for Paul, marriage does look back to the original acts of creation. It requires a level of mutual fidelity between partners that mirrors the original congress of God and the human creature." And so he emphasizes fidelity, as you were talking about, faithfulness. But it's always important. I have known ministers and Christians in general who are not married, and that is perfectly reasonable. It will have its set of struggles, but as Paul says somewhere else, those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and there are struggles in marriage as well.
Right. I would caution against hearing that, what he's writing there, or reading what Paul says about marriage, and thinking that in some way you are going to be able to do more for the gospel, more for Christ, if you force yourself to stay single, despite a desire for marriage and a desire for that relationship. I would just caution against that. Paul is not writing here in order to encourage that, because indeed, marriage is a gift from God, instituted in the Garden of Eden when he created Adam and Eve. It is a good thing. And even when you look at Paul's letter to Timothy, 1 Timothy, when he writes about biblical qualifications for elders, his expectation is that these are probably going to be husbands, and he says they need to be the husband of one wife. They need to be a one-woman man. And so I would just caution against taking Paul's statements here in isolation from the rest of Scripture, and thus concluding that, because I actually say this because I've seen, especially whenever I was in college and younger, I saw people around me convinced that if they were going to be faithful to the calling that the Lord had put on their life, or most faithful, they needed to remain single, even though they really liked the idea of having a husband or a wife, but felt like that would be a distraction, and that if they could just keep themselves free from that. And I struggled. I had a problem with a lot of the way they would view it, because for them, they almost felt like, I have to take on this burden of singleness despite my desire, which I think is a good desire, to have a husband or a wife.
If you have a strong desire in terms of just intimacy of a companion, and yes, in terms of sexual intimacy, if you desire to be married with everything that comes with it, then you ought to be asking questions about okay, then, and I both mean questions yourself, but questions to the people who care about you, because if you have those desires, then it likely means that you ought to seek to get married. You ought to pray that way. And look, if you are going, but I'm not sure, well, then pray and continue to talk to those who care for you and walk through that. People that I have seen who have remained single, there are people who don't have as much of a desire in terms of relational, I want to be around people a lot. Look, most of marriage is hanging out, and there's just a whole lot of downtime, and it's just being together, and both that, and if sort of sexual desire might be lacking, or might if you are looking at yourself going, but for some reason I don't think that I'm lean in that direction, that's fine. You should be discussing that. And so it is just something that we always need to mention here. One specific detail to draw attention to, because this was shocking, as we've already mentioned, to Roman listeners, that this is what Christianity is. Yes, it was surprising to them that they believed a man had come back from the dead, but it was almost equally surprising that, so wait, the men are just keeping themselves to one woman?
Yeah. That was mind-blowing.
It was, yes. It was completely shocking that a man would limit himself in that way. And with all the accompanying sort of like, well, surely women could do that, but not men, and again, we have sources on this. We have doctors, Galen is mentioned here, a Greek doctor who said, and they don't expose their infants, but they try to keep to only each other sexually. They take that seriously in a marriage, the man and the woman. This was shocking to them, including, he says, quote, Paul's ban on porneia restricted one of the slave owner's most ordinary prerogatives, sexual access to his slaves. So no more.
Exactly.
That was a Christian form of conduct that was outlawed for a man to use his slaves sexually. It was against Christian conscience. It says later, quote, the conspicuous austerity of the early Christians caught the eye of early observers, including the Greek Dr. Galen, who I just mentioned. In the competitive marketplace of Roman imperial religion, the way in which Paul loaded questions of sexual morality with dramatic significance related to salvation gave the moral teaching of this small but vocal movement a particular flavor. People noticed, and they said, are these people crazy?
Yeah.
Can this be done? And this is the way Christians were not just recommended to live. And I would say this to any pastor who may end up in conversations with young people or young adults or grown adults about this. You can calmly assert that Christian sexual morality is reasonable, best, and good for young couples, middle-aged couples, and grown couples. I have both seen young couples treat this as if it were outlandish. I have seen, for instance, divorced couples who run into, even on something like a Christian dating website. Well, since we've both been married, then sex doesn't really matter now. This is an idea and an attitude that is out there, and that is completely false.
Right.
You need to, while we're on the subject, divorce is not something that you should try to hide in your church from your pastor. You need to talk these things through. Yes, you need to go through counseling, but when that has gone through the course, and if divorce still happens, you need to walk through that. This is not something that you want to not deal with. It will wreck future relationships if you don't deal with it. But also, being divorced doesn't mean that all of a sudden all sexual rules are gone at all. In fact, they hold. If you want to express yourself sexually, get married.
Right.
That's how it works.
Exactly. I think that's an important word. And I mean, it is pointing to exactly what the article is titled. This is a sexual revolution we're talking about that is coming about through the influence of Christianity. Let me see here. There was, I've already said this, but it's worth noting again. He writes, again, this is the point about what the Apostle Paul puts forward, the Christian idea of sex, and particularly with regards to the restraint that the Christian sexual ethic requires surrounding sexual activity. But he says, however close they were in time, place, and occasional idiom, what seemed like subtle differences between Epictetus and Paul, in fact, point toward an impassable chasm. The Christian revolution in sexual morality was a departure from, not an acceleration of, Stoic asceticism. So here's why he brought up the philosophies of Epictetus. Am I saying that?
I think either way is fine.
Whatever way. Is he saying, when we first read about him, when he first introduced him in the first lines of the article, you might think, well, that kind of sounds akin to a Christian ethic. But it is not. It is It is so different, even though there might be an occasional idiom that sounds similar. These are not just subtle differences. There's an impassable chasm between the two, because one sees, we'll just read it. It says, it was a radical break from the warm, earthy paganism, or pagan eroticism of the kind we find in romance. He talks a little bit about the romance. We won't get into that. Neither here nor there. He says, Christianity put forward a new cosmology, a new ethics, a new vision of human solidarity. In short, a new view of human destiny that makes sex far more important. In other words, different from the Stoic position and different from the pagan position of the Roman commoner. Christianity said, no, sex is not just something insignificant. It's not just something either to be embellished or indulged in or not. It is something with great moral and spiritual significance, which is just so powerful in understanding what it was that was happening at the time, and how we as Christians understand sex today, even still. We look back to what Paul has written, what changed the world still is what we are called to fight for and hold to today in the face of different, in a sense, threats, and yet not so different at the same time. Our stand remains the same. We say sex is important, sex matters, and God has given us sex as a gift.
Yeah.
But he has given us this gift to be engaged in the right and proper context of one woman, one man exclusively, right? And while the world is sort of changing as far as its idea of the purpose of sex and personal identity and how sex is related to that, because that's quite different from the Roman understanding of the purpose of sex and the role it plays in your identity. They really didn't see it that way, as playing a major role in your identity,
right,
like we see happening now in our culture. But even still, our stance remains the same. Our approach, our view of sexuality remains constant from then to now.
Yeah. Yeah, and so in the Roman view, your name was a big deal, who you're attached to, what you did. Sex was an afterthought in a lot of ways. You mentioned the mingling of souls. Look, what you believe about God and your connection to God is the most important thing about you in the Christian view. But who you become is directly influenced by who you share yourself with. And that is important sexually. We've talked about a lot about sex because obviously the title of this article is The First Sexual Revolution. But this is the same reason why we see there in the New Testament, bad company corrupts good character. Be careful who you spend time with, who you look up to. You then will seek to be like them. And so we just have to be careful who we mingle with and what we are after at every level. And so really that ties us up for sort of like, what was the first sexual revolution? Well, it was when Christianity came in and said, no, sex means something. And we want to fast forward here through in our final part about, okay, what have we been then seeing in, say, the last 50 to 60 years or so? In the book A Secular Age, Charles Taylor describes the 1960s as the hinge moment in the longer arc of modern secularization. And so he basically says that we no longer imagine the self as journeying, he says, toward final redemption. We're not seeking freedom as much as we're seeking our own view of happiness, trying to formulate some sort of life, some sort of set of experiences that might make us happy. And he says, quote, in this model, sex was and is the crux of secularization. According to Taylor, the 1960s saw the sensibility of romanticism broadened into a mass phenomenon. Modern romanticism is more centered on man. Romanticism in this sense means an ethic of individual expressivism in accord with codes of authenticity and freedom. And I want to bring in the person that I've heard talk the most about Charles Taylor is Tim Keller. If you haven't listened to too many Tim Keller sermons, Charles Taylor will get mentioned a lot. And I think Tim Keller has been the most insightful of anyone I've heard talk about what we think we're trying to do and how little we are succeeding at it. And so the idea then that is presented here that many of us have taken in, whether we realize it or not, is if sexuality is such the center of yourself, you ought to figure out how you could express yourself to achieve happiness. Ask yourself, you're the only person who knows, ask yourself what kind of sexuality might make you the most happy, and then go seek to express it somehow, which is as limited as it sounds, because certainly, thankfully, we still respect boundaries of others, so that there is a big problem with this that you're going to need to find someone to express yourself with, and apparently randomly you're going to have to hope that they also want to express themselves with you in a regular, consistent fashion or in some kind of relationship. But I guess that's neither here nor there in a lot of senses. But later on, I've got a few thoughts from Tim Keller, but to tie up in the main article that we have here, he says, quote, an avowed secularist is as likely as a Christian activist to proclaim the universal dignity of all individuals, you mentioned this earlier, and insist upon the individual's freedom. And yet, however moralized the domain of sex might be, the vast, vacant universe seems to have left only authenticity and consent as the shared public principles of sexual morality. Mm-hmm. And so then what this is saying is that The only thing we seem to have left is I have an interest, a feeling, a desire to do something sexually. If someone is willing to go along with it, well, then infinite happiness for however long this might last. And that's literally, this is the story that is pushed in a lot of movies. It lives on the internet, and it is not satisfying, but we also, in a secular world, don't often question it. And so it seems to dominate. And I want to give clarity to it. This is, again, from Tim Keller, and this is what we see. This is what is considered normal. This is why so many young people do seek to live together before they're married, or why some ideals expressed in movies that you ought to want something, go find someone, immediately engage in some kind of sexual activity, and thinking that's somehow the top of the mountain. He says, the modern therapeutic self is a recent approach to identity, which it is. We are to look within our desires, especially our sexual ones, and then determine, according to Freud, or create, according to Foucault, who we are, not allowing anyone else to validate or define us or make us feel guilty. So this is the approach that we are seeing, the therapeutic idea, that you look inside yourself, nobody else can tell you who you are, they can't tell you anything. So you have to figure out some way to get these definite answers to this question by looking inside of yourself. And then you determine, according to Freud, or you create who you are. You proclaim it to everyone. There is a strange gospel
your
to
identity.
This. Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
You go in some inner adventure, find yourself, and then you proclaim, this is who I am. You expect the world will then not only accept but celebrate you and whatever you have determined, and they don't get to validate you, define you, or even make you feel guilty. They have an option to celebrate you or nothing. And this demand goes out. This gives two problems, he says. Problem number one is that you cannot discover a real you by looking at your changing and contradictory inner feelings. If you haven't been paying attention, your feelings change. You will need a standard of values by which we will sift our inner drives and determine which ones characterize our true and false selves. He has a brilliant treatment of this by pointing to an Anglo-Saxon warrior. If you'd gone to an Anglo-Saxon warrior in the 1400s and you had said, are you aggressive? And he'd say, oh, yes, I will fight at the drop of a hat. Oh, that's good. Or do you usually win? Oh, yeah, I do. Well, then you're an awesome warrior. You're impressive. This is how they define themselves. Mm-hmm. But he says, if you take that person and you stuck them in, Los Angeles right now, and you saw them define themselves by aggression, they would end up either in jail or in a mental institution. And we would say, no, you can't define yourself by aggression. You can't just say, well, I beat up anybody I please, and because I please. We like to carve out aggression and say, oh, you got to be really careful with that, which you do.
Sure.
But meanwhile, we refuse to carve out sexuality and to admit that there ought to be things done and not done with that, no matter the consequences. And it's just, it's nonsense. It is utter nonsense. Now then, he says, Christians believe the Bible gives us that standard to determine our dehumanizing desires and our right humanizing ones. He says, problem number two is that the modern identity is highly performative. You must realize your inner dreams or desires and constantly perform. So you realize, you try to find some enduring desire, and you either carry it out or you constantly perform your suffering. So then this leads to fragility, which you may have seen in people, a constant need to be reaffirmed. He says, no wonder any criticism at all is crushing or feels controlling. But meanwhile, Christians' deepest identity is in Christ, who loves and accepts us counterconditionally despite all our flaws. So Christian identity is received, not achieved. You don't try to find something in yourself and then impose it on yourself and the outside world. It is received. Who is your Father? This is why when we are adopted into God's family, and Christ is not ashamed to call us a brother or a sister, that is so powerful. We don't perform to be received or to have affirmation. He says, most of the criticisms of the biblical sex ethic assume the modern therapeutic self as a given, and that's a part of the biggest problem.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It is assumed as self-evident to all, and clearly it is not.
Right. In other words, this is why so many people will say, well, to tell me to suppress my sexual desires, to tell me to deny who I am. This is who I am, and why should I deny myself this? Why should I deny who I am?
Yeah.
And we understand as Christians that, yeah, you are saying that because you are so steeped in this idea of the therapeutic self, of understanding, discovering, creating who you are, what your identity is by looking inward. And that's, it's just problems. But as Christians, we say, no, our identity is not based on something inside of us, but something outside of us, chiefly Christ. Our identity is found in him. And it is a very sweet thing to recognize that, though, a very good thing, very comforting thing, because to have to discover myself, my identity, to have to try and figure that out by figuring out myself, man, it's no wonder people have come up to all kinds of wild conclusions about who they are and how they ought to live and what have you, because human beings are so fickle. Even when we try to understand ourselves, we struggle and we can't do it, certainly not accurately, apart from looking to our Creator, the one who created us.
Right.
Why wouldn't we? That's the funny thing, too, to think about is, why would we look into ourselves to try and discover who we are instead of looking to the one who created us? It's like finding just a really wild-looking contraption. Actually, you ever watch the show American Pickers?
Yes.
Yeah. So on that show, they find some of the craziest things in these barns and junk sales, whatever. And sometimes they'll come across tools that just look totally foreign. Mm-hmm. If it were left up to us to try and figure out, looking at this antique tool, trying to figure out what it is intended for, we could come up with all kinds of wrong answers. Yeah. And who knows where that could lead us. But what you could do is you could just figure out, okay, well, who created this thing, who invented this thing, and go back to the source and see, what is this tool used for? What is this tool? What's it called? What does it do? And that will give you the most accurate and sure information. Well, same thing with us as human beings.
Yep.
We find our true identity when we turn to the one who created us, because he created us. So he not only knows it, but is happy in Christ Jesus to show that to us and to share that with us. It is not something that we have to discover. It's not a secret that needs to be unhidden, unburied, discovered. No, he actually tells it to us pretty clearly in his word.
Yep.
And that's a very comforting thing, and relieves a lot of the burden from us to have to try and do that ourselves.
Yep.
We don't have to.
The Christian position is you are more than your sexuality. You are more than your aggression. That in part, one of the wildest kind of very small passages that you see in the scriptures, that there's it says in the book of Revelation that those who are in Christ will receive from him one day a white rock with a name known only to him and them, between him and them, because he knows who we really are. And so, yes, the identity then, it is received. And so Christianity says God knows who you are. Then you walk with him and you learn who you are. You walk in a community. Identity through the relationship with God first. Identity second with the community. That is, people who love you, not for what you can do for them, not for what they can get from you, but they love you because of you. And because they've been trained to love by God. Those are some trustworthy people then. And you can learn then. It's a safe place to learn trust. And that's what we have to be in the church. And that is a good atmosphere to learn who you are as a young person or as an adult, whenever you have an opportunity. Instead of this exhausting task of trying to find some idea of who you are yourself from the inside that no one else can tell you anything about. Mm-hmm. We should not be surprised when the Christian truth is that some desires are to be encouraged. Your love for God has no limit. That we are not told. We don't take some stoic view on love for God. Your love for God will grow throughout all eternity, and so go ahead and grow it right now as much as you can. Incidentally, he says you can know your love for God by loving others, so that we then have a godly love for others around us, as the scripture so often says, with absolute purity. And then that's how we ought to live these lives of love. But some desires are to be encouraged, Some are to be killed entirely. This is what we mean about sinful desires, which all of us have, and all of us, as a Christian, what it means is that you manage every day your desires, that you pray to God to help you be rid of some desires, to help you grow some desires, and to help you temper certain other desires. We don't take any of our inner desires and put it on the throne. God is on the throne, judging all of them, enabling us then to figure out how to walk every day. Meanwhile, we should not be surprised that in our world, some people then, if you say to them, find a desire in yourself and let it rule you. Well, what if that is stealing? Okay, worse, what if it is murder and hate? Some people devote themselves to hating certain people and are surprised when it becomes murderous.
Sure.
There are too many dangerous desires in us to make any desire the throne of your life, the center of your heart. But what we are seeing right now in this new sexual revolution and in the fruits of it are new kinds of mixed damages. There was a certain kind of damage that was happening in Rome, but it was a simple kind. And then we have walked through a period where, yes, look, in ancient Greece and in Rome, something like homosexuality was practiced. And yes, Christianity did say, no, that's harmful. That is not God's design. And it is very present in the New Testament that the Apostle Paul says, this needs to stop. This is not a legitimate form of sexual expression. And Christianity was the driver's seat behind saying, we need to leave that aside. What we see now is the return to this, well, any sexual desire can be good if the people are willing.
Mm-hmm.
That is not Christianity. That is not healthy. It's not going to be good, and it will not be fulfilling.
Mm-hmm.
We will never know any of this, though, if we're not willing to be honest about it.
Right.
And what we've been walking through has not been a period of honesty. I think everyone should ask why, if, as we know, the sexual revolution really takes off in the 1960s, right around when the birth control pill became widely available. Why then did it take something like 50, actually more closer to 60 years for a book like The Case Against the Sexual Revolution to come out? Why were we so hesitant to ask the questions about, hey, is this thing working? Because, spoiler alert, I want to increase interest in this book. The only people that are really benefiting from the sexual revolution at the end of the day are high-status males who have in themselves the capability to engage in sexual practices and also keep their feelings back in general. Mm-hmm. They are in this moment where communication is widely available, able to get a lot of women to sleep with them, to have sex with them, and then do whatever they like, moving on as they like, not moving on as they like. But meanwhile, who are the losers? Mostly everyone else. That is the result. And it continues to our day where we are seeing issues like transgenderism, which is causing all kinds of problems. And this is not God's design.
Mm-hmm. To be clear, when you say who are the losers, everyone else, you don't mean to say that, like, from a Christian perspective, they are the winners and we're all the losers.
No.
You are speaking from a worldly perspective.
Yeah.
If we accept where the culture has directed us to in regards to the sexual revolution, it leads us to that as the only real conclusion. We can only conclude from a worldly perspective, from a secular perspective. It's hard to see how this has been just an overwhelming good for everyone equally. It just has not been. And we would say, in regards to those high status males that you were talking about, that while we might look from a worldly perspective and think, wow, they are the ones who are winning, the reality is they are losing.
Yeah.
With regards to what this is doing to their soul, what this is doing spiritually to them.
What I'm saying is that they believe themselves to be using others, and it will be detrimental to their own soul, and it already is, but mostly what's happening with others is either they are wanting more relationships than they are getting, or they are getting no relationships whatsoever because of the way things are changing. And this is a large problem.
It is. That's right. But it's one the Bible has the answer to. You know, and we see the answer going all the way back to ancient Roman times, whenever Christianity began to spread throughout the Roman Empire and really changed the world. So it was indeed the first sexual revolution. Yep. Praise God.
All right, let's leave it there. This has been Empires of the Future.
And we'll see you in the future.